1961, the chainsaws came to Fillmore County, Minnesota. Not all at once, not in a single day. It happened quietly, farm by farm, woodlot by woodlot. A stand of oak would fall here, a line of hickory would disappear there. And where trees had stood for generations, corn moved in. The reasoning sounded simple. A tree doesn't produce a single bushel of corn. An acre without trees can be planted. An acre planted produces income. That was the math. That was what people said at the co-op on Saturday mornings. That was what equipment dealers said, leaning on counters with coffee in hand. That was what the new county bulletin said, printed clean and confident. Clear the trees, expand the fields, increase production. On paper, it was perfect. So nobody asked what the paper was missing. Almost nobody. Amos Keller didn't ask. He watched. Amos was 46 that spring. He farmed 320 acres along the northern edge of the county, where the land rolled gently into low ridges and shallow slopes, cornfields, hay ground, and one dark strip of timber along the northern boundary, 28 acres of old trees. From the road, the woodlot looked different from everything around it. In summer, it held its own shade. In fall, it burned gold and red in the evening light. In winter, snow piled thick along its southern edge, where the wind broke and dropped what it carried. Most farmers didn't see any of that. They saw wasted ground. Gerald Baines said it out loud. You can't farm trees. Trees don't pay the mortgage. Trees don't fill a grain bin. You want money. You cut them down. Laughter followed, not because it was clever, but because everyone wanted it to be true. More acres meant more rows meant more bushels meant more money. And machines always needed more acres. Paul Mercer, the county agent, didn't laugh. He just added numbers. 70 bushels per acre average, he said. Tree ground produces no annual yield. Conversion increases total output. Efficient, clean, convincing. Amos Keller stood near the door while they talked. He didn't argue. He rarely did. A neighbor turned toward him. Amos, you still got those trees. I do. When you gonna cut 'em? Not this year. More laughter. Gerald shook his head. You're letting money rot in the shade. Amos finished his coffee, set the cup down, and walked out before anyone could turn his answer into a joke. That was the part people didn't understand. He never tried to win the argument. He just kept doing what he was already doing. That evening, he walked into the woodlot. The entrance wasn't marked. Between two old oaks. The ground changed the moment you stepped inside. Softer, darker, covered in years of fallen leaves turning slowly into soil. The air was different too. Cooler in summer, warmer in winter, heavy with the smell of wood, and something older than that. Amos knew every tree in that place. Not by name, by behavior. He knew which oak caught the deepest snowdrifts, which ridge took the hardest wind, which patch stayed damp longest after rain, where the birds nested, where the soil stayed dark. He didn't call it science. He didn't call it ecology. He just called it knowing his ground. In winter, the trees caught snow. In spring, that snow melted slowly into his field. In summer, the wind hit the canopy and softened. In fall, leaves drifted out onto the edge of his soil and disappeared into it. The trees weren't standing still. They were working. That night at supper, Evelyn asked the same question everyone else was asking. Gerald still talking about cutting trees? Yeah. What'd he say? Same thing he always says. She set a plate down in front of him. And you? Amos looked out the window. The woodlot stood dark against the last light of evening. I think Gerald sells tractors, he said. And tractors need more ground to run. Evelyn smiled faintly. And what do you need? Amos didn't answer right away. I need the wind to slow down, he said.
I need the snow to stay where it falls. I need the soil to hold water one more week in July. If I cut those trees, I gain acres, but I lose everything that makes those acres work. Evelyn didn't argue. She had learned something about Amos over the years. The shorter the sentence, the longer he had been thinking about it. Outside, across Fillmore County, the chainsaws kept running. Smoke rose from burn piles. Fields opened. Timber disappeared. People called it progress. And every time someone drove past the Keller farm and saw that dark strip of trees still standing along the northern edge, they shook their heads. Amos Keller didn't explain himself. He didn't need to. He walked that woodlot every evening, listening to the wind change its voice in the leaves, feeling the ground under his boots, watching what the trees were doing. He couldn't prove anything yet. No drought had come. No hard year had tested the system. But he knew one thing. If something had been quietly helping his farm for years, the fact that it didn't show up on a balance sheet didn't mean it had no value. It only meant the numbers were looking in the wrong place.
Amos Keller didn't learn what those trees were doing from a book. He learned it from a kitchen window. Year after year, season after season, watching the same piece of ground behave differently from every field around it. It started in winter. The wind in Fillmore County came hard from the northwest, cold, dry, and constant. On open ground, it swept snow clean off the surface, left the soil bare, and carried the moisture somewhere else. But at the edge of Amos's woodlot, the wind stopped, not completely, but enough. Snow piled up along the south side of the trees, drift after drift, building through the winter. By February, the ridge of snow there could stand waist high. And when March came, that snow didn't disappear in a day. It melted slowly. It soaked. Day by day, it worked its way into the soil, right where Amos planted his north fields. He didn't measure it. He didn't need to. He could see it in the color of the ground, darker, heavier, holding together when he picked it up. Across the fence, where trees had been cleared, the soil dried faster, cracked sooner. Same county, same rain, different start to the season. Spring brought the wind again, harder now, warmer but faster. Amos had watched it hit the woodlot for years. You could see it. The tops of the trees would move first, then the branches below, then the air that came through on the other side was different, slower, broken. Not gone, but tamed. On his north fields, the soil stayed where it belonged. Across the road, on land that had been cleared, fine particles lifted. Not in great storms, not yet. Just a steady, quiet movement. The kind you don't notice until it's been happening for 10 years. Amos noticed. He always did. Summer showed him something else. He didn't understand insects the way scientists did. He didn't have names for them. But he could see damage, and he could see the lack of it. His corn, row after row, had fewer chewed leaves, cleaner ears, stronger stands. He didn't spray less than his neighbors. He didn't farm different varieties. But something was different. In the evenings, if you stood at the edge of the woodlot, you could watch it. Birds moving in and out of the trees, small shapes flickering through the rows, insects rising, then disappearing. He didn't call it pest control. He called it balance. Fall brought the last piece. Leaves, thousands of them, drifting down from the canopy, caught by the wind, carried out into the edge of his field. Amos never raked them, never burned them. He let them sit. By spring, they were gone, not vanished, changed. Broken down into the soil, feeding it, darkening it, softening it. Free fertilizer. He never used that phrase. But he understood what it meant. Snow, wind, insects, leaves. 4 things. None of them showed up in a yield report. None of them appeared in Paul Mercer's bulletin. None of them were counted when someone said, "You're losing money by keeping trees." Amos didn't argue with those numbers. He just knew they were incomplete. One evening, Evelyn sat across from him at the table, running her finger down a page of figures she'd written out. "Gerald says we're losing about $2,000 a year," she said. Amos nodded. "I've heard." She turned the paper toward him. "I started counting something else." He leaned forward. "Firewood," she said. "Fence posts from fallen trees. Plums, nuts, things I sell in town. Feed savings in winter when cattle stay sheltered." She tapped the bottom of the page. "It's not 2,000, she said. "It's closer to 1,400 we're gaining, and that's just what I can count." Amos looked at the numbers. Then back out the window. "That doesn't include the soil," he said quietly. Evelyn followed his gaze. The woodlot stood there, dark against the fading light. "No," she said. "It doesn't." That was the difference. The rest of the county was measuring acres, bushels, cash per season. Amos and Evelyn were measuring something else. Not in charts. Not in bulletins. But in what the land did, when no one was trying to force it to do anything else. By the mid-60s, the clearing had spread. Woodlots vanished. Fence lines disappeared. Fields grew wider, straighter, cleaner. And Amos Keller kept walking into his trees every evening. Not to defend them, not to prove a point. Just to watch. Because somewhere deep down, before the drought came, before the wind took anything visible, before the county realized what it had lost, he already understood something no bulletin had ever told him. A farm isn't just what you plant. It's everything that makes planting possible.
By the late 1960s, Fillmore County didn't look the way it used to. From the road, you could drive for miles and never see a break in the fields. Where there had once been dark strips of timber, there were now straight lines of corn. Fence rows were gone. Brush was gone. The land had been cleaned. That was the word people used. Clean. Cleaner fields. Cleaner edges. Cleaner operations. And on paper, it worked. More acres meant more rows. More rows meant more bushels. More bushels meant more money. For a while. At the co-op, the conversations changed. Not about whether to clear anymore. That decision had already been made. Now it was about how fast you could expand, how much ground you could cover, how big your operation could get. Gerald Baines had new numbers to share. Wayne Fawcett cleared 40 acres on his east side, he said one morning. Picked up nearly 2,500 more bushels last season. Heads nodded. That was proof. Bigger planter. Bigger combine, Gerald added. That's the direction this county's going. Then someone said it. The same line that had been floating around for years now. What about Amos Keller? A few chuckles. He still got those trees? He's still farming around them. Man stuck in another century. The laughter was easy now, because Amos hadn't changed, while everything else had. His fields still curved slightly along the edge of the woodlot. His rows still broke where the trees began. His acreage hadn't expanded. From the air, his farm looked irregular, out of place, not efficient. That was the word they use for him now. Inefficient. Amos didn't come to the co-op much anymore. Not because he was avoiding anyone. Because Saturdays were for work. They always had been. Instead, he spent his evenings the same way he always had. Walking the woodlot. The path through it wasn't marked. It didn't need to be. His boots had worn it in over the years. He stepped over roots he knew were there without looking. Past trees he recognized the way some men recognize faces. There was a white oak near the center of the stand. thick enough that two men couldn't reach around it. Lightning had struck it years earlier. Split one side of the trunk. Most people would have cut it down. Amos hadn't. He watched it. Year after year, the wound closed slowly. The tree adapted. It leaned slightly now, but it was alive, stronger than it had any right to be. That tree meant something to him, not because it was valuable, but because it proved something. Living systems don't always fail the way people expect them to. They adjust. The county didn't think like that anymore. The county thought in straight lines, straight rows, straight fields, straight calculations. What you gained, what you lost. Nothing in between. But Amos lived in the in-between. He noticed things that didn't show up in numbers. Like the way the soil felt under his boots at the edge of the woodlot compared to the open field. Darker, softer, holding together. He noticed the way his corn stood when the summer winds came through. Less leaning, less breakage. He noticed the birds, always had. They stayed, while other farms got quieter. He didn't need a report to tell him something was changing across the county. He could feel it. In the soil, in the air, in the silence. By the early 1970s, the first signs started to show. Not dramatic, not yet. A lighter patch of soil here, a thin drift of dust along a fence line there. A field that dried out just a little too fast. Farmers mentioned it, briefly, then moved on. It's normal, Paul Mercer said when someone asked. Freshly cleared ground takes time to settle. That sounded reasonable, so people believed it. But the settling never came. The soil kept moving. Slowly, quietly. The kind of loss you don't notice until it's already happened. Wells dropped too. Not much. A foot. Maybe less. But enough for people to mention it. Enough for them to wonder. Still, no one connected it. Not to the trees. Not to what had been taken out of the system. Amos didn't say anything. He didn't go to the co-op and point at the fields. Didn't stand at the edge of someone else's land and explain what he saw. That wasn't how he worked. He just kept walking his own ground. Watching. Waiting. Because somewhere deep down, he understood something the rest of the county didn't want to see yet. You don't always lose a system all at once. Sometimes, you remove one piece at a time, and only realize what that piece was doing when it's too late to put it back. The trees were gone from most of Fillmore County, but their absence hadn't fully spoken yet. That was coming, and when it did, it wouldn't sound like a chainsaw. It would sound like silence. Dry soil, and a harvest that didn't come in the way it used to. The summer of 1978 didn't arrive all at once. It crept in. April came light on rain. May came lighter. By June, people were watching the sky more than they were watching their fields. Clouds would build in the afternoon, hang there, and pass without dropping anything. The ground noticed first. Topsoil that should have been dark and cool started turning pale. Fields that normally held moisture into early summer began to dry out by mid-June. At the co-op, the conversations shifted again. Not about expansion. Not about equipment. About rain. How long's it been since the last good one? 2 weeks. Feels like longer. It was longer. By early July, the drought had settled in. Not dramatic. Not the kind that kills everything overnight. The slow kind. The kind that tests every weakness in a system. Corn started to show it. Leaves curled in the afternoon heat. Plants stood shorter than they should. Color faded from deep green to something thinner. On the cleared fields, the difference was sharper. Without windbreaks, the hot air moved fast across the soil, pulled moisture out of it. Day after day, what little water was left faster. By late July, some fields looked like August. Dry, flat, tired. Amos Keller's north field looked different. Not perfect, but different. The corn stood taller. Leaves still opened in the morning. Color held longer. Not because it had rained more there. It hadn't. Same sky, same county. But the ground started the season with more. The snow that had drifted along the woodlot had melted into the soil. The moisture had stayed. And the wind didn't strip it away the same way. It hit the trees, broke, and passed through softer. That difference didn't show up in April. It showed up in July. One evening, Wayne Fawcett walked his east field. The same 40 acres he'd cleared years earlier. The soil there had changed. He could see it now. Lighter in color. Thinner under his boots. His corn stood uneven. Short in patches. Thin in others. He kept walking until he reached the fence line. On the other side, Amos's field. The difference stopped him. Same row spacing. Same planting window. But not the same result. Wayne stood there a long time. On his side, the wind had worked the ground for years. Quietly. Steadily. On Amos's side, the trees had been working just as quietly. In the opposite direction. Wayne didn't call anyone over. Didn't say anything at the co-op. He just went home. Harvest came early that year. There wasn't much to wait for. Across Fillmore County, yields dropped. Fields that should have made 70 bushels came in at 50, sometimes less. On the worst ground, 45. The numbers weren't catastrophic, but they were enough. Enough to show a pattern. On farms where trees had once stood, the losses were heavier. Not by chance, by design. The system had changed, and the drought exposed it. Amos Keller's fields came in higher. Not dramatically higher, but enough to notice. Mid-70s, better than the county average. Better than the clear ground. His best yield in years, in one of the driest summers the county had seen in a decade. At the co-op, people didn't laugh as much that fall. They still talked, but the tone had shifted, less certain. Gerald Baines didn't bring up Amos Keller anymore. Not that season. Because the numbers didn't line up the way they used to. The acres that had been added weren't producing the way they were supposed to. And the acres that had been left alone were holding. No one stood up and said it out loud. No one said, maybe the trees were doing something. But the thought was there. In the quiet. In the way conversations ended a little earlier. In the way farmers looked a little longer at the edges of their fields. Amos didn't change anything. He harvested his crop, filled his bins. And that evening, like every evening, he walked into the woodlot. The air was cooler under the trees. The ground still held moisture. He stood there for a moment, listening. The wind moved through the canopy above him. Soft, broken. Not the same wind that had burned across the open fields all summer. He didn't smile. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. Because for the first time, the rest of the county had seen what those trees had been doing all along. The drought of 1978 didn't change everything overnight. It didn't make anyone rush out and replant trees. It didn't erase the years of clearing. But it did something more important. It planted doubt. For the first time, people in Fillmore County weren't completely sure they had done the right thing.
And once that doubt exists, it doesn't go away. It waits. The next year was better. More rain, stronger crops, fields recovered, at least on the surface. At the co-op, the old confidence started to return. Just a bad year, someone said. Drought'll do that. Heads nodded. It was easier to believe that than to rethink everything. But not everything went back to the way it had been. Some fields never fully recovered. Topsoil that had moved didn't come back. Moisture that had been lost didn't hold the same way. And quietly, without anyone announcing it, people started paying attention to things they hadn't noticed before. Wind, soil color, the edges of fields, the places where trees used to stand. Amos Keller didn't say a word about any of it. He kept farming, kept walking his woodlot. And time kept doing what time does. Then in the early 1980s, something unexpected happened. A man named Carl Drenner drove into the county. He wasn't a farmer. He was a timber buyer. Hardwood prices had been rising. Furniture companies were paying more than they had in decades. Carl had been driving county roads for days, looking for mature timber, and finding almost none. Most of it was gone, cut, burned, cleared. Then he drove past Amos Keller's place. He slowed down. Then he stopped, got out of his truck, and stood there, staring at the woodlot. 28 acres of trees that hadn't been touched. Old growth, straight trunks, full canopy, healthy stand. In a county that had cleared most of its timber, this wasn't normal. This was rare. Carl walked the edge of it for nearly an hour. Then he drove up to the house. Amos met him in the yard. "Name's Carl Drenner," the man said. "I buy hardwood." Amos nodded. Carl gestured toward the trees. "That's the best stand I've seen in 3 counties. Amos didn't react. "How much is it worth?" he asked. Carl took a breath. "I'd need to mark it properly," he said, "but just walking it." He looked back at the woodlot. "You're looking at 6 figures. Easy. Selective cut. Leave the stand healthy." Amos didn't answer right away. For 20 years, he'd heard one number. $2,000 a year. That's what the trees were supposed to be costing him. Now someone was telling him those same trees were worth more than most farms in the county had ever made in profit, and they were still standing, still working. He nodded once. "I'll think about it." Carl left. Word spread. It always does. At the co-op, the conversations changed again. Not laughter this time. Something closer to disbelief. 6 figures. For trees? The same trees that had been called useless for 20 years. Gerald Baines heard about it. He didn't say much at first. But one evening, he drove out to Amos's place. Found him, standing at the edge of the woodlot. The same place he'd stood 1,000 times before. Gerald stepped out of his truck. For a moment, he didn't say anything, just looked. At the trees, at the field beyond them, at the soil. Then finally, "I told everyone to cut theirs," Gerald said. Amos nodded. "You did. I sold them bigger machines, so they could farm more ground." "Yeah." Gerald let out a breath. "Some of that ground isn't what it used to be." "I know. And yours is." Another pause. Gerald looked at the trees again. "How'd you know?" Amos rested his hand on the rough bark of an old oak. "I didn't," he said. "I just watched." Gerald frowned slightly. "Watched what?" Amos didn't turn. "The snow," he said. "The wind. The soil. What stayed, and what didn't."
Gerald was quiet. All I saw was acres, he said. Amos nodded. That's what you were looking at. They stood there a while longer. Wind moved through the canopy above them. Soft, controlled, not the same wind that crossed the open fields. Gerald finally turned back toward his truck. I was wrong, he said. Amos didn't answer. He didn't need to, because this was never about being right. It was about seeing something, before anyone else thought it mattered. Amos Keller never cleared his trees, not because he was stubborn, not because he was sentimental, because he paid attention to what the land was already doing. The woodlot stayed, the soil stayed, the yields held, and the value of those trees kept growing. Years later, his children would walk those same paths, watch the same snow drift along the same edge, feel the same wind break in the same place, and understand something that took the rest of the county decades to learn. The most valuable part of a farm isn't always the part that produces a crop. Sometimes, it's the part that makes the crop possible.
Co-op laughed for 20 years. The trees stood for over 100. And in the end, the trees won.